morning, Brennan.
Good morning, Chris. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm good. I've got my, I don't know if it's going to show up well on the camera, but I've got my Chris Mickey Mouse mug from when I was a child. Like, this has got to be at least some years old. I'm not good at math this morning, but
that is excellent.
How are you?
I'm doing well. I have a boring water cup. I drink a lot of coffee this morning pretty early. I was up early. I did bake some cinnamon rolls this morning, so I was up early with my daughter's help, Margaret Ann, making a little special breakfast.
That's awesome.
So it was fun.
That's awesome. I got toilet paper at Kroger for Mother's Day, so we're all winning.
That's a big find. It is. Wow, surprising.
I only had to fight 3 people for it.
Yeah, and you can deal with some Scubala that way.
That's right. Coming a preview of coming attractions.
And speaking
Brennan,
of previews of coming attractions,
yeah. So we've got something exciting coming down the pike. We've got 2 more weeks, including today, of our study of Philippians. So today and May 17th will be on Philippians. But what's happening on May 31st? So we're going to take a week off for Memorial Day weekend. But then what are we going to be doing on May the 31st?
So May the 31st, we'll start our second round of Bible studies for office hours. We've got a great response to the first go through with Philippians. So we're going to try the other testament. We're going to go talk about the book of Job. So we're going to spend 5 weeks discussing the book of Job. We'll start by talking about the prologue, the first couple chapters, which has the narrative story. We'll move into the dialogues between Job and his friends. We'll talk about the God speeches. And we'll wrap it up by talking about the big questions of the book of Job. Why do bad things happen to good people? Where is God in the midst of chaos and disruption? And what in the world do we do with the current environment that we're living in that is all disrupted and full of honestly sickness and things that seem to be falling apart? Where can God be found in all that? So those are the big topics that we have, and we'll have some great guests that will be joining us from across the country and from the Theological Academy, and people who love and serve the church, just like the folks that have joined us through this study of Philippians. So I'm so excited. And Chris, thanks for wanting to do this again.
Oh, it's going to be great. And I think we talked about it earlier on the phone this week. And I have sort of either a very basic understanding of Job, like the surface level reading, or like I sort of throw my hands up and I'm like, what is going on with this book? So I feel like I might not be the only one who feels this way about Job. And so very much looking forward to our study of Job. And again, like you said, it's such a timely time for us to be studying the book of Job, because many of us are now wrestling with these big questions of where is God in the midst of really hard stuff, and how does our theology either adapt or not adapt to those realities? And I think that we see some really interesting stuff happening theologically in the book of Job. So again, don't miss it. We'll start that study May 31st. We'll get out some more details about our guest lecturers, about the description of the class and all of that. There will also be an opportunity to register for the sort of advanced level with additional readings and videos. So stay posted for that, but May the 31st. I already see some people making comments in Facebook, but if you're viewing, if you've already logged in, thank you so much for checking in, telling us where you're at, where you're joining us from. And we are so grateful that you're here this morning. So Brendan, we're talking about the largest portion of Philippians today, Philippians 2:19 through 4:1, where we learn about Paul, we learn about some of Paul's colleagues, and we learn about Paul's view of his maybe we might say his privilege or his former accomplishments, and so it's a really important part of Philippians. It's a lot of ground to cover, and we are going to be joined momentarily by Shively Smith, the Reverend Dr. Shively Smith. And maybe we can talk about her while she's not on. That seems totally appropriate,
right,
for us to do.
Well, so Shively Smith is a wonderful biblical scholar, excellent preacher and teacher. She is someone that Chris and I both know from her time at Emory University, and where she got a PhD in New Testament studies. She has written a book on First Peter, which is interesting. We had two First Peter specialists on 2 days in a row. She's working on some really interesting new work on metaphors and models, and the way that that works in the New Testament. So we're actually going to ask her a lot of questions today about some of the topics that we're covering in Philippians chapter 2, especially about these kind of models of Timothy and Epaphroditus, but then also the model of Paul in chapter 3. And we can ask about how that relates to the idea of imitating Christ, which is throughout the book of Philippians. So we're excited to have her on, and she's at the Boston University School of Theology, where she is a professor of New Testament there. So yeah, we're really looking forward to it. And she has got like several things lined up today. She's on some other, like another teaching call this morning. So we were glad that she was able to fit us in, but she'll join us when she can.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And we'll just have her jump in. Shively and I both wrote our dissertations under Luke Timothy Johnson, who is just a lovely man, who is the Woodruff Professor of New Testament at Emory University, and many people have probably heard of him, who are watching today with us. Well, what do you say we just sort of hop in to this part of Philippians?
Hey, there she is.
Oh, she's coming in. She's coming in.
We were just introducing Dr. Hey, how's it going, Shively? Great to see you.
Hello, so good to see you guys.
Oh,
thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. Apologies, I was doing things for the cathedral. So, here.
Yeah, we are just thrilled that you joined us. Yeah.
Yeah, we were just pining away in your absence, and we've got a lot of bitterness that we can work out later. But no, Shively, thank you so much for being with us. We know you have a busy morning. So we did just do sort of an introduction to you. We promised we didn't say anything that's not true, only about your brilliance and your teaching abilities. So.
Although I do want to ask one question before we jump off, which is, Shively, do you remember our trip, our kind of junket with Carl Holiday through Turkey? Yeah, that amazing experience.
It was amazing.
It was amazing. One thing I wanted to just say is that you were the one that taught us about the Sebastian at Aphrodisias, right? And that was an amazing talk. I still use that whenever I teach about the Roman Empire and so on, and imagery and Judea Capta. It was really wonderful. But what was your favorite moment of that trip through Turkey?
What was my favorite moment? You know, my favorite moment was Ephesus.
Oh, that was amazing.
That was so amazing to be in the site and to be able to see where the library was and to really begin to. So I still use our pictures from that as a way to help students begin to do the work of imagination and reconstructing what that world actually looked like, right? So not what our cities look like, what did their cities look like. That was something that was so powerful to me. The other piece that I loved about that was really the journey. I mean, I think the bus ride with all of us being together, and we were sharing and moving between being, nerds in the biblical world and then having fun and listening to music, to really recognize that as scholars, most of us were students still at the time, that there's a way in which we are real human beings and we're not just, that stays with me. And I try to pass that on to my doc students even now. Yeah. I'm like, so what do you like to do for fun?
Right.
Does that exist?
I have to say, like, hearing you guys talk, I'm having this moment of feeling like the little brother in a family of like, that was back in the day when we were able to take family trips, and we, like, that was before Dad lost his job, like, because I didn't get to do that trip. I didn't get to go to Turkey. I didn't get any of that.
Oh no, the bottom fell out.
The only thing I did was, and this was actually really sentimental and great, was I helped Luke Johnson move his books to the monastery in New Orleans when he retired. And so we loaded up a U-Haul and had 6 Krispy Kreme donuts as we drove down to New Orleans, and gas station coffee. It was classic.
Living the dream.
That's right.
Well, so Shively, again, thank you so much again for joining us. It's just so fun to have you here, and you are someone that whenever you speak and teach, I'm always on the edge of my seat listening. So, but we want to begin by asking you 2 kind of big, broader questions. We usually begin by asking people, just in general, like, what are your theological presuppositions, or at least a couple of them, some things that inform your reading of the Bible. That's that's usually where we start. Would you mind just kind of giving us some tips? Kind of what do you usually start with?
Yeah, I mean, so I always tell people I tend to stay in my lane. So I always start with those New Testament texts. One of the presuppositions that I'm always working with is that all of these writings, in a large degree, are insider writings. And so these are not written necessarily in the spirit of trying to convert or make or present new information to people who have no clue of the proclamation of the good news of the characters, the apostles, the prophets, Jesus. Like, these are all written with the expectation that people have a clue about it. Right? Which is a big deal for me, I think, because of sort of my original place being initially in sort of more missionary-based evangelistic sort of circles when I initially, as a little girl, so the pastor's kid and that sort of piece. And so that has been a real eye-opener for me, as is to shift to imagine that John 3:16 actually wasn't written for you to go and say, "For God so loved the world," to someone who has no idea about the Son, but that everybody already has that story. So that's one thing that that does something that's I presuppose. The second thing that's related to that is I tend to presuppose that in large part a lot of the audience, the intended audience, represent people that are managing what it means to live on the fringes in some ways. And I mean, this also has to come from the fact that I work quite a bit in the Catholic letters these days. And so there's all the more striking for me there. But while Paul's writings, the writings do talk about people with particular kinds of resources, the overwhelming majority represent groups of people that do not have power or access to resources. They're more clients than patrons. They're more slaves and servants than the master class. I mean, so there's a real way in which, what does it mean to read these writings from a place of the absence of power and resources, rather than from the place of power and resources and privilege. And that does a lot in terms of humbling me, I think, right? And recognizing that some of this stuff that they're talking about in terms of relationships, in terms of how you relate to each other, how you're relating to your own environment and to your own kinship, that stuff is hard. I experience it every Thanksgiving and every Christmas. And then I get into a plane and go home, right? So with the absence of that sort of transportation and technology and movement pattern, how much more difficult are some of the expectations and propositions and proclamations that are being made in the writings to people to think about themselves differently in relationship to each other, in relationship to their communities and their kinship groups, in relationship to the society and the local community that they may have been navigating for generations.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you. And we already mentioned this a little bit before you hopped on, but if you could just tell us a little bit more about your work, particularly in the general epistles or the Petrine epistles, the First and Second Timothy or First and Second Peter, or just your work on biblical metaphors and models more generally. And then we promise we'll actually hop into this text on Philippians.
Yeah.
So my base work tends to be in Petrine letters. First Peter was my first book. Second Peter is the commentary I'm finishing up right now, thank the Lord. And so I love looking at what we call the Petrine discourse period. So I mean, the Second Peter one, I've been able to do a lot more looking at the apocalypse of Peter, looking at sort of the way in which Second Peter in particular seems to capture all of the traditions. So Second Peter, you end up hearing about the transfiguration. So we get these signals back to the gospel tradition. You hear about Paul, so you get these signals to Paul's literature showing up. You get to hear about the prophets sitting alongside the apostolic authority and witness. So I've really have enjoyed working on Second Peter and treating it as what I'm calling the sort of gateway text in the canon, and the way in which it allows you to look backwards at the generation, at the traditions before, and also becomes a great way of thinking about what's happening in the apostolic fathers as they're thinking in relationship, not just to Peter, but to Paul and the gospel tradition. So, I mean, that's the work that I do there. Related to sitting alongside of that is my work dealing particularly with hermeneutics and metaphor. So this year, I'm actually a scholar teacher for the Calvin Institute. So I got a scholar teacher grant in which I'm
Congrats.
I'm working on exploring our interpretive metaphors with Howard Thurman, our interpretive metaphors with Howard Thurman, which is really about getting us to begin to think. This is related to what we just talked about, Brennan, the visual. How do we visually represent our hermeneutics? How does the biblical text itself present models or metaphors for interpreting that we should be retrieving and paying attention to? And then I use Howard Thurman to help us do that work. So these are sort of two parts of my work they can stand separately, and at times they overlap. The last thing I'll say, where you can kind of see all of that coming together, is this week, I was actually one of the contributors for Working Preacher, because First Peter, so I ended up getting tagged for that.
Yeah.
And so in my First Peter entry for today, I think you'll see where this sort of I merge my work with First Peter also with this work on hermeneutics and metaphor. So that's a really great accessible representation of what my work is doing these days.
Very cool. And yeah, that sounds amazing. So I'll really look forward to learning from you with that project. And if anyone out there listening has not read Howard Thurman, Jesus and the Disinherited, please pick it up, grab it, and also check out Shively's work on Working Preacher to help us get a way to apply it into our own context and also biblically. So thank you again. So let's go ahead and jump into Philippians chapter 2, verse 19 through chapter 4, verse 1. This is like Chris said, a lengthy kind of part of the text, and there's a lot of different things going on in this section. Chris kind of summed it up in the syllabus by saying a lot of it's about examples, right? And it starts with these two big examples, Timothy and Epaphroditus. I mean, there's a lot of questions to ask here, but it seems like a bit of a segue. And even in like one of the study notes that I looked at, it said like, yeah, this is kind of a throwaway section, like a little like segue or something. And Shively, you're saying no. So Shively, what does this have to do with the kind of the meat of Paul's letter?
Yeah, I think actually, so I mean, some scholars have said that. I think that's wrong. Not that I feel strong.
Yeah, not at all.
I think that this section 219 right up to 3:1 really represents what this whole letter is about, which is really about kind of, again, here's my theological presupposition, in-group relations, right? So Paul is not only just talking, I mean, here, really it starts from, I would actually say this starts right at probably, am I looking at the right place? Yeah. So right more like 2:17 and 18 as well. But this is setting up all kind of relationship dynamics. It's Paul in relationship to the Philippians. It's Paul, Timothy, and the Philippians. It's Paul now talking about Epaphroditus in relationship to his own community, the Philippians, and then what all of that means. I mean, so like, how do all of these different relationship dynamics are in play, and they could be in tension, but Paul's presenting them as non-intention. In fact, he's making a really hard plea to the Philippian Jesus group to not, in fact, hold something against Epaphroditus, which is he was sick. He wasn't able to do everything he was supposed to do as, the person that you sent to me, but he did his job well. Give him honor. I mean, this is the crux of what it means to be a loving community, a community that's complex, that's nuanced, has many relationships that are in play at the same time. How do we have multiple relationships, different power dynamics at play, and they don't clash? They don't have to come into tension with each other. They can actually complement each other.
Huh. Wow, that's really deep. And kind of going along with that idea of the one mind that we saw in chapter 1, but then also comes up again here in chapter 3, like not having one set of beliefs necessarily that all match up, but having this one kind of mind of humility and love towards one another that is lived out and acted out, right, with all of these kind of, like you said, complicated dynamics, and trying to keep those things in tension, but also kind of managed with one another. And I mean, to me, it was really striking to me to read these kind of really loving, encouraging things that Paul is saying about the Philippians, but also about Timothy and Epaphroditus. But then also Paul notes his own anxiety about these tensions, right? And like there's all this stuff about today that brought up in me, like COVID. I mean, the fact that like, I mean, just to recognize it, it's Mother's Day, and Shively, happy Mother's Day. And, you know, but there's also this, you know, real severe anxiety today, I mean, just in general, but also about distance. And, you know, I can't go see my mom today on Mother's Day. To recognize this is kind of always there for a lot of people, right? There's a lot of people in the world today who Mother's Day is both a joyful thing, but also a painful thing about loss and separation. And that does produce anxiety. I mean, today, I was reading a Facebook post by Bill Brown, my colleague here in Old Testament at Columbia, whose mother passed away a few days ago. But then he also wrote a post saying that, you know, he was grieving about the loss of his mother, but then he read an article about Wanda Cooper Jones, Ahmaud Arbery's mother, and just thinking of the loss and the separation on this day, kind of piled on top of all of the loss that people are experiencing just throughout this context. And that does produce anxiety in us, right? But Christians often are told, like, don't feel anxious, right? Or it's bad to feel this way. You're supposed to be triumphant, joyous, only have joy. And Paul does say be joyful here, but he also says, I'm full of this anxiety too, right? So, I mean, it just struck me that it's like a recognition that it's okay to feel this way. It's okay to feel out of control right now. It's okay to feel questioning about things. It's okay to feel consumed sometimes with worry about all this stuff that's happening right now. And there's maybe a way to balance that with kind of rejoicing, but also not overwhelm one with the other. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think, so this really goes back to me talking about the ways in which I think the biblical text models for us this. I mean, that not only can these things be held in tension, but the way in which Paul uses this to actually name that, right? So he names the what didn't happen with Epaphroditus instead of pretending like it did. He names his anxiety as a way for the community to hold that and to do something constructive with it, not something destructive with it. So he's not naming because he wants them to think that he can't hold up as their spiritual father. The Epaphroditus is incapable of doing it. He's naming that so that they can say, oh, okay, and we can all hold this together. I think that that's really so powerful now with the social distancing, the ways in which, how are we constructing our faith communities and our relationships to hold our truths, to hold the real concrete experiences we have so that we can continue to live as a community, so that we can find joy and flourishing there. That's one of the other reasons why I love this, that our faith is big enough to hold the proclamations of joy, but also to hold the proclamations of anxiety, of failure, of not doing something, and then still finding a way for all of us to live.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. One of the comments on Facebook said, ask the question, is it okay to be, so it's okay to be situationally anxious, but know that ultimately God has it all in hand. And I think that kind of adequately sums up that we can hold these tensions. And so much of, you know, Christian traditions that I've come from and that I'm familiar with is, Brennan and I were talking earlier, either be stoic, like imagine like there's no emotions, or be a sunny day Christian all the time. And we see here in Paul, like a lot more, you know, this is Paul the human, and this is Paul wrestling with anxiety and being separated from people that he loves and in communities that he loves. Another thing that I love about this section of Philippians is that Paul mentions these two co-workers, Timothy and Epaphroditus. And we talked the very first week of this study about Paul's colleagues and co-workers and how it's easy to think of him as this like brilliant genius, solo genius out in the world. And Paul, you know, it seems to almost always, if we're reading carefully, point to other people who have either been his partners or his helpers. And it makes me, what I was thinking of this morning was, who, you know, what pastors, people who are leaders in congregations, you know, asking the question, are you doing the same thing that Paul does? Do you point to the people who are your companions, who are your colleagues? Do you point to the people that you couldn't get this work done without in your life? You know, we know the practice of, in scholarly monographs, writing the acknowledgments at the beginning. But what would it look like for us to be a people, communities of faith, that are rich in these acknowledgments, that are name dropping, not the people that we know, but the people that, like, I couldn't do it without, you know, these people in my life, and to sort of tear down the solitary genius or the charismatic preacher or the, you know, whatever else, that this work of ministry is far more collaborative, far more community based than we often experience or often think of it.
Yeah, I love to think of Paul as trafficking in community and relationship building. Like that it is actually not his tendency to go out there solo. It's always his tendency to bring along and or to go along with. I mean, if you start reading Acts, you start realizing it's not always him who's leading, right? From Luke's perspective. So it's really great to think about Paul as being communal, people oriented, and he is a person that has companions, and he accompanies and is accompanied in his work. That especially from the scholarly endeavor, so that can be a little humbling for us too.
Right.
Well, in the way that, though, you know, these are the parts of the letters that people skip, but the endings of Paul's letters where he's name dropping, and the ways that he's sort of interweaving relationships and saying, hey, I know this person and this person knows this person, and everybody's saying hi. And again, we live in and in the Hellenistic context was this way. The first century was this way, very competitive, and so Paul could have gone about it in a different way. And there, to be fair, like there are places where Paul is very controlling and claims that people as his own, but he can also be very collaborative. And I wonder what it would look like for us, not to network just to sort of get one step higher, but to do the sort of weaving of relationships that we see in Paul's letters of this person knows this person and I know this person, and we're all in this together. I just love, I mean, again, it's not deeply theological in the sense that it makes its way into systematic theologies, but it's so practically theologically significant that I hope we don't skip over it.
Just one last piece to that, Chris, I would ask you guys, is it just weaving relationships or is it care tending relationships? Right? So, I mean, there's a way in which there's connection, but there's a certain kind of care tending and maintenance of the relationship that happens when you're bringing each other along. Quite frankly, I would say this moment right here is, to me, a care tending relationship. We're all colleagues. We were all in school together. I wanted to jump on just to be with you guys and stuff, to have like, yes, we haven't done anything together. And so, what does it mean to see our work as believers and as a community being not just about interweaving, but care tending? How do we repair, strengthen the relationships that are there?
Yeah, no, and just to that comment, you know, just the beginning of this introduction, and then we can move on. But when Paul holds up Epaphroditus and Timothy, he says all of these other people were seeking their own interests.
That's right.
And what just a great model of this is what it looks like to do that caretaking, is to seek to genuinely seek the interests of others, the upbuilding of others. That's the language of 1 Corinthians. I know I'm blending, but
we'll take it.
I mean, it strikes me on Mother's Day, which, you know, of course, men and women should be taking part in the work of care tending, but it's often gendered in both the ancient world, I think, but also in the contemporary world, as, you know, masculine work to kind of go out there and like found things, do things, win things, build things, and then like the feminine work, you know, is kind of like seen as kind of secondary or lesser, and often not accounted for in the economy. Like, I mean, our GDP is going like crashing like crazy, at the same time that we're all working like crazy, and like we're working like crazy because we're doing this work that nobody's ever accounted for in the economy because it's usually been categorized as female labor, right? Which is often not counted for, right? Now, you know, so in any event, just thinking about that care tending work, like, I mean, a lot of pastors, a lot of professors, a lot of people in positions of power don't think of that care tending work as like key or central, right? Or it doesn't count. Like, how does that count in like even the way that my work gets counted? You know, like often, like where does it come up in my review? You know, like, and I think my dean and my president are starting to push that way, and some other institutions are too. But often it's like, you know, the kind of building up your colleagues or something is just seen as like kind of secondary, nothing work. But how central that is, you know?
I agree.
Yeah, and if we can, I just want to 1 second plug that you know, the caretaking work, the feminine masculine work. Next week we have Beverly Gaventa joining us, and one of the first books of Beverly's that I read is Our Mother, St. Paul. And she goes about looking at Paul and gender and the ways in which Paul cares for his communities, not just in a typically masculine role, but as a mother, as a caring mother. So you don't want to miss it. Another way to think about Paul, and we're going to talk about Euodia and Syntyche with her. But okay, can we move to a next section, which is where Paul's language gets a little strong in 3:1 through 3. A little bit strong, Shively, and we're talking about caretaking. We're all of a sudden Paul's not taking care as much as he's taking down. So what do we do with this part of the letter? The dogs, the evil workers, the mutilators of the flesh. What's going on?
And just to say, this has been so strong a shift that some scholars will even say these are two different letters, that this one got shoved onto the other one or something. I know a lot of people now disagree with that. They say, well, now it might just be a shift in something, but just to say that how strong this is. But Shively, what do you do with this?
Yeah, so I was going to actually say that this is one of those places where we think that that the question gets raised: is this a composite letter, right? So is in fact this is something of another letter. I deal with the final form as we have it, so we have it all put together. So let's deal with it. Yeah. I think the biggest piece for me that we end up seeing is this is like the Paul for me of Galatians, the Paul who's in conflict with clear opponents, right? So so it's very rhetorical, right? So that he has
very rhetorical.
He has this naming metaphors even of what he's doing that's toward the negative that are really toward his opponents, and then you've got Paul's sort of naming of the things that he sees as good. So for instance, you get dogs, which for him, unclean, evil workers. That's the opponent label. But then you get him using sort of alluding to clean and good. I love this. You don't see it you can't see it as clearly in the English because you have to see it in the Greek. But the way he talks about the katatome versus the peritome. So katatome, mutilation, versus peritome, circumcision. So in the Greek, you see this sort of juxtaposition that he's playing with that you can miss right here. So this is really Paul being rhetorical, setting up us versus them, a me versus them, which again goes to this whole in-group dynamic that I think is in play here in Philippians in totality. I could keep going on. They put stock in the flesh. I and you do not put stock in the flesh. We worship the Spirit and have honor in Christ. There's constant juxtapositions that are happening in different ways.
Yeah, there's so much, in fact, that we had Eric Barreto on a couple weeks ago, and we were talking another Emory guy. We were talking about whether or not Paul's opponents are even physically like real, or if these are almost rhetorical. We can't know. But this language where we have the contrast with peritome and katatome, but also the word for evil workers in the Greek sounds a lot like the word for missionaries. And so Paul seems to be playing with this. And whoever these people are, if they're real opponents or false opponents, he's clear that they're leading the Philippians astray, or that their way is leading them astray. And he says that we are the circumcision, which, I was with a course of study class a couple weekends ago, Shively, and I said, the funny thing about reading Paul is that so much of his writing has to do with male genitalia, and we never talk about it, right? We just sort of automatically translate circumcision into something that's less like, squirmy. But he's saying that we are the true circumcision in this spiritual sense. Right. Which, maybe we're engrafted into God's purposes. We've been included in God's covenant. I don't know what we think about this spiritual circumcision, and what that means, either in the first century or in the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, I find, so a couple of things. I find this becomes a great place to think about, which is something that you would see like Howard Thurman picking up on, is sort of the importance of the spiritual, religious experience, or the spiritual or the
Right.
mystical dimension of Paul, that sometimes we sort of go brush over because we want to talk about the practical Paul or even the situational Paul. But there is something to the fact that he's intentionally juxtaposing pneumatikos versus flesh here, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so what that means, I'll tell you one last thing that's really important to me here is in starting in 3:4, if anyone has reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. Yet whatever gains I had, these I have come to regard as a loss because of Christ. So that's important on at least two levels. One level for me on a personal level is sort of in my Pentecostal background side, I grew up hearing this like being recited in worship and service as a way to talk about what it means to be a believer and to not wear any of these titles,
Right.
and so to talk about humility in a real way. So for me, I always have to wrestle with the way in which I was conditioned to hear this as what it means to be humble, which at times is caused real tensions for me when I think about what it means to, have this PhD now and actually to
Right.
be sitting as a person who, not a Pharisee among Pharisees, but, a teacher of the
Yeah.
text. So there's a way in which sometimes I think that this can be dangerous. We don't pay attention to why Paul is doing this, because you might miss the ways in which what we are doing in the world is what is vocationally what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to lean in as
Right.
teachers, so we're supposed to lean in as a judge or as an attorney or as a servant or as a service person. Like that is the work of that we have been graced and called to do, to serve the community and the world. Thurman would say it is the work that your soul must have. It is the sound of the genuine in you. So I want to be very careful that we don't allow that to X out or mitigate or diminish the sound of the genuine that some of us have really struggled to live in and are struggling to live in even now.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
on the second level, I would say this is very important for us as scholars, because this is the place where we go to start trying to build the profile of Paul outside of what we get in Acts too. So
Right.
on the historical reconstruction level, this is very important for us to understand historically who was Paul, what did Paul actually do, what was his status, what were the groups, the collegium, the alliances, the identity markers that are really historical to him. And I want to hold that up too. Now, is it rhetorical? Does he just construct this out of nothing, or is this rhetorical based on the facts of his historical profile? That's something that we discuss quite often in our field.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is a place where it's important for us to consider the rhetorical dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to consider the possibility that there's some parallel between what Paul says about himself in 3:7 and following,
Right.
and what he has said about Christ and the sort of the Christ hymn in chapter 2. But it does present some problems,
Right.
and wondering. I mean, one of the things that I introduced the first week was Paul the Jew. I said, Paul never stops being Jewish, and so it's not that he's emptying himself of being Jewish, right? It's not that he's saying that this doesn't matter necessarily. So what is going on? Because if we read like in Romans 9-11, Paul's got a deep love for the Israelites and for his siblings in Israel, as he refers to them there. And so what does it mean that he's regarding this as nothing, these accomplishments, and whether it's rhetorically or theologically, how do we make sense of it? And maybe I'll let you resonate with that. I'm just gonna sort of when I read this text, it seems like he's getting more and more narrow, right? So he's saying, I was circumcised on the 8th day. Great. Okay. That's sort of standard for Jewish men to be circumcised on the 8th day. And then he gets even smaller, that he was of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews.
Which
as
means
to
he
the law,
speaks Hebrew?
Pharisee. A Hebrew born of Hebrews.
Does that mean he speaks Hebrew? He can read Hebrew? Use it liturgically? I mean, no, we don't know. I don't know. Yeah, just wondering.
Go ahead, Shively.
So this gets debated what that means, right?
Yeah, right.
I mean, Hebrew among Hebrews could actually be, he's sort of talking about his particular lineage in comparison to others. In one way, on one level, it also could be related to learning. What do you have, Chris, on this?
Yeah. So again, I think I had to mute myself because my dogs are barking. So yeah, I think that there's I think that there's definitely some debate. I mean, I tend to read the Hebrew of Hebrews as being an insider among insiders. You know, when I teach this text, there's this wonderful article by C.S. Lewis called "The Inner Ring," which talks about how people always want to be a part of a more inner or smaller ring, and how you often get to that inner ring and you realize you don't even like the people that are in it. But it's just the process of being exclusive or excluding other people that really is at hand. And so I think that Paul, for me, that's what I think Paul is doing here, is saying, I got to the inner ring. I got as narrow as I could possibly be. And I found out that I gained nothing in doing so. And I think that rhetorically it's important, because Paul seems to be dealing with communities that always want to get higher. They always want to get in the inner ring. That's their inclination. That's their desire. And Paul is saying, I've done it. I've been there, and it is worthless to me. And not those status markers, and certainly not Israel or the covenants, but that desire to get into the inner ring is what is scubala. That's what is empty. That is what is
or refuse, waste,
or
excrement.
refuse. Yeah, right. And that, all in comparison to gaining Christ.
Yeah. I think the other piece to put to advance that even more is to think about the inner ring as being moving into the inner ring as being a place of moving towards more security, more safety, more power, more resources. So again, if we sort of, like I said, where my theological location, if we imagine that more of these people are sort of further out, doesn't just have to do with status. You also become your life becomes less secure. So it is actually a life lived with less resources, less power. So Paul's actually pushing on that social reality to say, yeah, it's not just status, but all of the security, all of the safety, all of the ways in which you think power is really here. That's actually not where it is at all. So I want to push that to think about not just status, but we're dealing with social realities. We're just dealing with concerns of life and death, concerns of resources, concerns of access, concerns of security.
I see this a bit like as connecting to Ecclesiastes, a book that I love and work on as an Old Testament, scholar. And, thinking about how like this is this kind of quest in Ecclesiastes for like the good life. Like, how do you find happiness? I tried to do all these things. I like became, chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes. I became awesome. I built all this stuff. I tried to dominate people. I tried to own as much as I could. I tried to drink as much as I could, and it didn't really work, right? What worked only was finding joy in the midst of the trials of life, which sounds a lot like Philippians actually. And like, thinking about vanity of vanities, all is vanity is kind of the lesson, that's a little bit like scubala, right? This kind of like the stuff you think is going to fill you isn't really going to fill you. What's going to fill you instead is trying to really fill others and like empty yourself into your life and into the community and into like the work that you've been given to do in some way, right? That's kind of the fulfilling thing. I mean, it also makes me think a bit just like in terms of inner outer, Shively, what you were talking about, like the way that power works and the way that these texts get used, like because Christians often use these texts to other other people. I mean, Paul Nanos has an article that's in our sort of our folder that people can access for this class if you sign up. But Paul Nanos has this article where he says, like, Christians throughout history have used this text to say, hey, Jews call Gentiles dogs, so Paul's just returning the favor, right? So then Christians use that as a way, since John Chrysostom, since like the 4th century, of like saying, well, then Jews are dogs. And like, they did it first. And then it's okay. But instead, Paul Nanos points out that like a lot of people called each other dogs, and actually sometimes it was related to Artemis, like the goddess of the hunt, and like it could mean lots of things. Jews don't use it in particular to refer to Gentiles. Gentiles use it of each other. They talk about cynics as dogs, so it's like philosophical thing. So it could be anything. We don't really know, but just how it gets used. And Paul's kind of angry. I say this as an outsider to New Testament studies, but when you all are talking about rhetorical, like in part we emphasize that to mean like he doesn't mean this literally, but also be careful how we use these things, right? Rhetorically,
right?
Yeah.
But also, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Brennan.
I was just gonna say, like, and also the kind of the Christian-Jewish connection here. I think it's so important as someone who focuses on Old Testament studies. When I hear people from New Testament studies saying, "Hey, Paul doesn't ever say, like, he doesn't say that I have left Judaism, or I am no longer a Jew. I didn't call it skubala, like, refuse or whatever, excrement, and then reject it. Instead, I just said, these things don't get me what I want, but that doesn't mean I'm not who I am." And that's also maybe why Paul is saying to the Gentiles, also, you shouldn't stop being who you are too. Like, that's what Christ did. Christ made it okay for you to be this, whoever you are, and to join in and to worship of the God of Israel, and not reject your identity, your heritage, your culture, your language, and just like that Paul's not rejecting the fact that he's a Hebrew of Hebrews. He's saying that's great for me, but it doesn't get me anywhere ultimately. But also, like, that doesn't mean you. So I say all this because it made a lot of sense to me when Chris and other folks have suggested that the Judaizers that Paul's always angry at might be like cultural appropriators. They might be Gentiles who are claiming to be Jewish, but not really join the Jewish community, or like, they're not like actually becoming proselytes and like joining Judaism. They're just like kind of like Christians that have like kind of the Passover Seder, that kind of appropriate it for themselves, but then tell other people that makes them better than them. Is that a little bit what's going on here, you think?
I absolutely think of what you just said, actually making the connection to Ecclesiastes is helping me to read it differently, to think about what it means to really see this as sort of kind of a wisdom discourse within the Jesus group. Spinning. So once you hit verse 7, yet whatever gains I had, these I have come to regard as loss because of Christ. So I mean, the analysis, Jewish wisdom discourse that's tied around this proclamation of Christ and resurrection, and the section ends right with that claim in verse 10. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the sharing of his sufferings by becoming like him in his death, if somehow I may attain the resurrection from the dead. So it's the first time I've always dealt with it as rhetorical, as inside or outside in group, but to think about this actually being a sort of wisdom, a wisdom retelling, retooling that Paul is doing, also because his Judaism is intact for him. This is the logic and the symbolic world out of which he is talking and reasoning. Makes total sense. So thank you for that.
And I think it's Shively, thanks for reading those final verses in this section, because I think we also can't have this conversation about Paul and Judaism or Paul and these opponents without bringing up the resurrection of Christ. I mean, this is something I'm teaching a class right now at First Press on the resurrection, and we just started that. But for Paul, I don't know if we often really grasp just how significant that was for him. And a metaphor that I've, I think actually I was in a conversation with Luke Johnson about this, that, Paul is not in the business of rearranging furniture on the Titanic. No. Paul's understanding of the world, with a crucified Messiah now exalted as the Lord, and the resurrection, which sort of inaugurates this new age, means that he's all about the transformation of the world. He thinks that God is in the business of transforming it. And so often when we talk about Paul and Judaism, it's not like Paul lived his life as a Jew and found like it didn't work.
Right.
Like we often do with Luther. Like Martin Luther was, really dissatisfied with the spirituality and the form of religion that he experienced as a monk, and had this conversion experience. It's not like Paul found that Judaism became bankrupt. It's that he became convinced that this crucified Messiah was actually the Lord, and had come to share in the life of God, and it called everything into question.
Yeah.
And there's this strong break with everything leading up to that resurrection experience. And so this is what Paul's saying at the end of this passage is, I want to share in that resurrection. I want my life to be aligned with that resurrection reality. And therefore it's because of this resurrection that all of this former stuff is scubala, is excrement. And I want to live into that reality of Christ.
So can we try this on? Is it a strong break, or is it he gets through the resurrection and this the experience, his own experience, resurrection, he gets a new lens or frame by which he's able to now understand these sort of convictions of election, of monotheism, of Torah, of what and where is the temple, right? Of even land, our relationship to the land, our relationship to flesh. It does the proclamation of Christ as crucified, resurrected, ascended, give him a sort of new frames,
right,
but which is able to see everything differently. You might call it revelation. I always get nervous just throwing out revelation because I think it's so loaded. But does that kind of go in line with what you're saying, Chris?
Yeah. I think it's lenses, it's bodied, it's, I think that Paul's language of imitating Christ, of considering the interests of others, like this is all, it's easy for us to, think about Christianity as it's just in the brain, or maybe it's just in the heart. It's what you feel. But I think Paul, in his letters gives us this sense that it's your perception of the world impacts how you treat other people. It treats how you sort of embrace the world or don't embrace the world. And so, I think, it is, Paul is forced, I think, by the convictions of the resurrection, by this crucified Messiah who is now Lord. He sees the world entirely differently, and it seasons everything. I think.
I think so too. I think that's so much hope that this proclamation claim makes a demand on us to see the world differently, to treat each other differently, to think differently about our relationships and how we orient ourselves to the world. I was talking to, I guess, someone who's kind of more of a seeker, who maybe had some church hurt, right? In her background, it was sort of trying out what it means to come back into, a sort of believing community. And for me, it was really saying, that's part of our proclamation, is sort of thinking about how do we treat each other differently. And imitation, you said imitation, and how this shows up here. That language is so important to Paul and Paul's writings, that we are participating in a faith that has models that we can look at, we can imitate, that we can, we ourselves can be models of what it means to really be this all-encompassing new proclamation. So just my little theme there. I love this part. To me, there's a lot of hope here.
That is deep, and this makes me think about your work on models and metaphors, but also about imitation. I read this one little thing, I forget who wrote it, but it was saying, Paul often talks about imitation and imitate me, because that was a part of the Hellenistic, cultural context of learning and pedagogy. But it was kind of like downplaying it as in like, well, today we have better ways of teaching things, right? I mean, we kind of just give knowledge, and then people have the knowledge, and then like they know we don't need to do this kind of like, wasting time by like tutor, getting people to follow us around and do kind of shadow us and and enact what we're doing. It's kind of this apprenticeship model that's outdated, medieval, you kind of. And I was reading that and thinking, I mean, my goodness, we of course we learn better by example. That I see, we can hear someone say something, but if they don't actually do it, then who cares? It's a bit about the kind of the faith question with Paul. Like, does faith mean an idea, or does it mean like what you actually do with your life?
Yeah. I mean, I think for Paul, it's very visual. I mean, so this is the piece. I love these metaphors on top of metaphors. For him, faith and being in the community has a visual, it has a look. And he's trying out as many images and giving as many portrayals as possible, not because anyone sufficiently captures it, but it offers an opportunity for access to what I would talk about as theological, Christian theological imagination. And that even the way in which we think, contemporary cognitive sciences now show us that we think in metaphors and in images. So when you look at a book, Metaphors We Live by Lakoff and Johnson, you see this. You see Sally Maffei talking about this in her metaphorical theology, the power of this. I mean, I think this isn't something that just happened. Paul was on to something for what it means for us to not only just proclaim in head and in lip service this sort of theological, what you said, Chris, transformation, but how do you actually do it really? You get as many images that provide theological possibilities as you can, and you explore them, you propose them, and you keep going, right?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah, and like Della Yarborough Collins has an article about the Philippians hymn and how she thinks that maybe Paul wrote it. I mean, whether or not that, I mean, I don't think her argument rests on that, but that Paul is kind of a theologian, which in the ancient world meant like someone who composes things for like praise, maybe even of an emperor. But like, and we have this thing at the end here in verse 21, chapter 3, verse 21, of like all things end up being subject to Christ, which, you know, some people kind of question and have some theological problems with the kind of the dominance language or the language of kingdom and so on. But still, like the idea that Paul is taking this like image or metaphor or the image of the emperor, the one to whom all things are subject. But then Paul is also saying, and the kingdom that is produced by this kind of loyalty and this kind of faith and this kind of leadership and it's the image of Christ. It's people who give of themselves and who don't look for their own honors or privileges and they look to really share with the whole community. And so then this all goes back to Shively, when you pointed out that Epaphroditus may have failed in his mission, but Paul is saying, I'm going to lift you up.
Yeah, and I mean, honor and shame language is running throughout this whole section. So it shows up, not to take us back to that, but it shows up at 2:29. Welcome them in the Lord with all joy and honor such people, because he came close to death for the work of Christ.
All right. Well, so sorry to everyone. That was my computer. I think my internet access that kicked us out. So I hope others join us here for the last few minutes. Shively, can I ask you to go back and repeat, like just kind of catch us back up on that stream of brilliance that you were unfolding for us?
I was saying that I think honor and shame language is running throughout this section and is very important. I mean, I think so. If we look at 2:29, when he's sitting there talking about Epaphroditus and talking about not shaming him, basically, he says, welcome him then in the Lord with all joy and honor, which means without shame, such people, because he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up for those services that you could not give him. So the reason why honor and shame is very important here is, one, because you got to understand the context of Philippi. Philippi is a Roman colony. It is known for having quite a lot of Roman military veterans. And one of the mantras of the Roman military is that you fight until the death, right? So to not continue fighting until the end, to not complete your task, is very shameful. You see this again in philosophical schools, especially within like Stoicism, that that you are to finish and complete your task. So Paul's pushing honor and shame on one level to push against a cultural norm and convention that's normal, that no one would think of, that the obvious thing to do is to deal with the shame, that he is shameful. He's saying, no, there is honor even in that moment of him suffering. But then when we go here to the end in chapter 3:7, we get explicit shame language that shows up in verse 19 to opponents. Their end is destruction. Their God is the belly. Their glory is in their shame. Their minds are set on earthly things. But our citizenship, which is always very interesting to me, citizenship, commonwealth would be the way you could deal with that, is in heaven. And it is from there that we are expecting a savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Chris, this goes exactly with what you're talking about. This transformation of of what is normal, what is conventional, how we relate. He shifts where the honor and the shame goes, because we're in a world where honor and shame has to go somewhere.
Right.
I mean, that is an orienting social value. And you see Paul shifting what honor looks like and shifting what shame looks like, shifting what honor produces in terms of action and commonwealth and relationship, and shifting what shame produces in terms of action and commonwealth and community, and where we should be in that equation.
Yeah, and even just in that, in 21, 3:20 and 21, we see this language of humiliation and glory, which both of these are shame and honor. These are going in that register of language, those cultural and social understandings. And Paul is turning it. I mean, Christ's glory is not independent of Christ's shameful death. And Christ's glory, the way in which he's going to subject all things to himself, is not separate from the way in which he lived his life, the way that he died. And so Paul is shifting these categories that play in the register of shame and honor, but in a very sort of nuanced and complex way, because Paul, for Paul, I don't think that Jesus's glorious return is somehow going to ignore the way in which he died. That those two seem to be held together so tightly.
Yeah.
And
I was going to say, for me, here's the so what. If Paul's playing this game, then for me, my theological orientation, this becomes an invitation for us to do that now. So what are the conventional, traditional categories of honor and shame, insider, outsider, good, evil, that our society, our institutions are functioning off of, that we fundamentally need to do the alley-oop on and switch up? Exercise a certain sort of theological and moral courage to say, those are actually, that group is actually not shameful, right? That group is actually not the one without honor. That's the group that is with honor. Like where in our world and in our locations should we be doing this work that Paul is doing in this section?
Yeah. I love that. Yeah.
And it seems to me too, like there's a connection here between, there's a kind of an individual versus group thing here, like striving for yourself and like, your own identity, like, Paul, like I'm the best, I'm gonna like build up honors for myself. But then you can see how, the Christ's community, or even the way it's translated here, citizenship. And also there's the little note, at least in the NRSV, that says commonwealth, right? Which that's a very different, like, for modern conception, right? When we think of citizens, we think of like my own like rights and what I get from it and my own identity, or sometimes like what I brag about, like I'm a citizen of the United States. But the thing of like the commonwealth that we are a part of, thinking that way seems to kind of suggest a different model for like my role in this entire thing. Whereas Paul's opponents seem to be kind of thinking of themselves and building themselves up, etc.
The Greek there is polytuma, which I think what the NRSV is trying to get at, particularly in that note, is to get us to, like exactly what you just said, Brendan, to get us to move from thinking in our modern terms of citizenship as an individual to citizenship being very much a part of this dyadic society, the society in which it's all group collective identity, right? So it's not my individual, it's the relationship of us all to each other in this commonwealth, in this common society, in this common province, in this common city, in this common space together.
Wow.
All right. So Shively, we've already taken you 3 minutes longer. It's 10:33, and I'm sure folks are, starting to get anxious about going to worship. I just want to hold up a few comments. I saw at least 2 people comment that you taught them Greek. And so thank you for doing that. And another person said you were a breath of fresh air. I don't know what that says about me and Brennan, but it's also very true. You always are a breath of fresh air. Your joy is always apparent, as well as your critical reading, your helpful reading. And so thank you so much for being with us today. And I know we could go on for hours talking about it, but it's just been such a pleasure to have you on this morning.
Thank you for having me, and blessings to everyone as we are still in this Easter season and we're celebrating the work of mothering that has happened in all different forms and different
Amen.
ways in the world. Blessings to everyone.
Thank you.
To you, Shively. Thank you so much. And bye to everyone. We'll see you again next week where we have Beverly Gaventa. So join us then.
All right. Thanks, everyone.